Okay, we are live.
Right, we are reconvening our afternoon meeting and switching topics to beavers in Vermont, and we're welcoming John Aber.
I'll try to keep this as brief as I can, but I've been a volunteer licensed wildlife rehabilitator for 14 years. I got my license from the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife in 2011, and I also have a license from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to do raptors or birds. I trained at Vermont Institute of Natural Science. And I'm based in Roxbury, Vermont. I'm here to talk about my rehab of beavers, but also mainly to talk about my perspective on beaver wildlife management policy that comes out of my rehab experience. And I've been dealing with the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife for 14 years. I have to submit reports every month on the animals I have in my care. I've also attended a lot of the department's presentations on beavers. And what I'd like to address here today is what I see as a disconnect in the management policy of the department. On the one hand, I've seen the department extol the benefits of beavers on the landscape, but I'm sure you've heard all about that from other presenters. But on the other hand, the department aggressively promotes and licenses the trapping and killing of beavers. So on the one hand, beavers are great. We want them on the landscape and maximize the benefits on the landscape. And at the same time, we're trapping as many of them as possible because there is no limit on how many how many people can be licensed to trap beavers. And there's no bag limit on how many beavers each trapper can trap. So, my perspective is, how do you reconcile those? Can you have both, or is trapping inherently counterproductive and inconsistent with maximizing the benefits of beavers on the landscape? Anyway, my experience with beavers started in 2020. I got an orphan beaver kit from St. Albans, Vermont. He weighed only 1.5 pounds. That means he was about a week old. And rehabbing beavers are probably the most challenging animal of all to rehab. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that you have to rehab beavers for 2 years, because that's how long beaver kits stay with their parents in the wild. Beavers are also semi-aquatic animals, so they need constant access to water. They poop and pee in water, but they also drink a lot of water to aid their digestion of woody matter, and that's how they survive. So water is their safe space. They need constant access to water. So I'm going to quickly run through my rehab of beavers, and then I'll talk about the management issues that I mentioned here. We say in rehab, you have to provide 3 things to animals: food, shelter, and warmth. But beavers need a 4th thing. They need companionship. Beavers are very social animals. They mate for life. They form very close bonds in the colony, and you have to recreate that with an orphan kit as a rehabber. So you have to spend time with them and not just put them out in the enclosure like I'll do with a mink or a weasel.
Can you just let Annika know when you want the slides advanced?
Okay, or I can just press the button here.
She's running them because it didn't work for you to be in the Zoom room.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so at 2.5 months, I was able to put this beaver kit out in the enclosure. He was up to 15 to 20 pounds by that stage. The next slide, and every day. Could I have the next slide?
What slide are you on? What number?
What number? I'm on slide number 3. Yeah. So slide number 4. We took him to a stream just in back of our house every day to get him used to a natural environment. Beavers, their sexual organs are within the body. So to sex a beaver, you have to take an X-ray of the beaver, and the os penis will typically show up for a male. If it's a female, it won't show up in the X-ray, and that's the only way you can determine the sex of a beaver. By the winter, I kept this beaver in an indoor enclosure because if you leave beaver kits out in the outside in the lodge, the beaver will die without the whole family to have that warmth, that shared bodily warmth. Beaver kits will die, and this has happened to other rehabbers. So that's why we keep them indoors, at least for their first year. And so, he got bigger and bigger. He's up to 38 pounds. When he was a year old, I got another orphan kit, the same age as he, a yearling, and she was 23 pounds. The reason why we have a male and female like this is because if you release a singleton into the wild, they won't stay wherever you release them. They go and find a mate. The mating instinct is very strong. That's how they survive in the wild, by having shared bodies. They measure the temperature inside the lodge. It will be 70 degrees, but that's with the whole family in there. So he mated with, or got a companion, Mrs. Beaver. We could tell with her bug eyes. She had bug eyes like that. And by the summer of 2021, I built an enclosure for them outside. Half of this enclosure was in the stream, half on land. And this is provided to me by what I call Beaver Lady Cher Dobmeyer in New York State. She has 30 years experience rehabbing beavers. So they had constant access to the water this way. The problem is, as we all know, we've had flooding in Vermont recently, in recent years, and a flood came through on July 20th, 2021, and moved that enclosure. So, I built a new enclosure, which is in a pond that's fed by runoff. So that's not an issue anymore. Anyway, when I released this guy and his mate, Mrs. Beaver, in May 20th of 2022, he was 2 years old. That's typically when beaver kits disperse from the colony. And I found a location that already had a dam, but it was unoccupied by beavers. And he had a release house for this release, which I removed on July 5th. When I visited the site, when I visited him 4 days later, after releasing him, he was already wild. They wild up very quickly because their instinct is to go off on their own when they're 2 years old. So that instinct kicks in. So that's the last image I have of him. I also had other beavers too. I had a wild beaver that was found in Stowe that was mauled by a dog. And she was 2 years old, but she only weighed 14 pounds. So in the wild, these beavers are a lot smaller at 2 years old. BK was 38 pounds by comparison at this stage. Right after I released BK, I got another orphan beaver, but her parents were trapped. And this occurs under Title 10, 4828, where landowners can trap even out of season in order, if they perceive the animal as a threat. And this is a very permissive statute that probably should be tightened up because it can lead to tragedies like this. This beaver kit died because it was trapped before it got the colostrum from its mother. It was probably newborn, just born. It was only 1¼ pounds, and that's the weight they are when they're born. I'm publishing a book on this whole experience. I kept a daily diary, and I'm publishing it under Bringing Up Beaver with Simon & Schuster. Anyway, 2 lessons I learned from my rehab experience that I'll emphasize today. One is that trapping destroys the colony dynamics of these colonies. These colonies have beavers have very close relationships within these colonies, and that dynamics helps control population. And even if you trap one beaver, that can disrupt those dynamics and cause chaos. Second is that even when trapping is done in season, and the trapping season on beavers is very long, it runs for about 5 months, from the 4th Saturday of October until the end of March. Even if you're trapping in that season, you're going to orphan beaver kits, because remember, beaver kits stay with their parents for 2 years. So a typical beaver colony, average 5 to 6 beavers. There's 3 generations here. There's the adult pair, male and female parent of the colony that mate for life. Then there's the current year's offspring. If we're talking about right now, it'll be the beavers that were born last year, last spring. And then the previous year's offsprings, those will be the beavers that were born in 2023 and are still with the colony. So you have 3 generations. So even if you're trapping in season, you're gonna orphan the current year offspring and previous year's offspring. And there's no guarantee that those beavers will survive. So is recreational trapping consistent with good beaver management? I'll just mention 3 points here, or 4 points rather. To the trapping season, is this well regulated? Because as I mentioned, beavers can be orphaned even if you trap in season. Is trapping an effective means of population control or tracking the populations of beavers? Trapping to obtain biological samples, is that valid for beavers? And finally, is underwater trapping even legal? This is a point that I'll explain as a result of the enclosure that I had outside. That was half in the stream, half out of the stream. Anyway, the trapping season, as I mentioned, runs from the 4th Saturday of October till the end of March. Now, this man has a trapped beaver that is probably 50 to 60 pounds. So that's a fully adult beaver, but that's probably equivalent to 4 kids. As I mentioned, the wild one that I got, who was 2 years old, was 14 pounds. So 4 of those would equal this adult beaver. So when you're trapping an adult like that, you're removing that body from the colony, and that's a lot of mass that's helping to keep the beaver colony warm. So you have to remember, this is not like a deer trophy or a bear trophy. You have to look at this beaver within the context of the whole colony. And one trapper posted, this is from the Vermont Fur Bearer newsletter. He says, I set 4 traps and had 4 beavers the next day. So the question is, were all those 4 beavers trapped from the same colony, or were those beavers trapped from different colonies? If they're all trapped from the same colony, that's, any beavers that are left are not going to survive because there's not enough bodies to keep them warm if you're trapping in the middle of winter like that. So about 1,200 beavers are trapped every year based on a 10-year average from the trapping pelts that are reported every year from 2013 to 2024, an average of 1,173, about 1,200 beavers. So that means that if, the trappers are very efficient and are trapping out the whole colony of 6 beavers, for example, that means at least 200 acres of wetlands are lost every year. Because when you trap out all the beavers, there's nothing to maintain the beaver dam. The beaver dam is going to degrade and you're going to lose, the water is going to run out, and you're going to lose that marvelous wetland habitat that's been compared to rainforest or coral reefs in terms of the biodiversity they support. If you have a lower denominator, like, you're trapping 2 beavers per colony, you're going to lose even more acres, 600 acres of habitat potentially, if the colony does not survive like that. Beavers self-regulate their populations, and they do that in 3 ways. One is that they lower their reproduction rate when there's not enough habitat to support dispersal of more beavers, and they've come to carrying capacity of the land. They will lower the reproduction rate, for example, by not having any kits in that year. They may go for several years without having kits. And also hormonally, they can lower their reproduction. There'll be a lower dispersal rate. The 2-year-olds will simply not disperse from the colony, and therefore they won't be reproducing for that reason. And third, they will practice infanticide. And this is something that rehabbers have discovered, really, I think, for the first time. You've all heard of Nibby, the famous beaver from Newhouse Wildlife Facility in Massachusetts. They were at BeaverCon when I presented at BeaverCon, and they told me that they had a beaver that was pregnant, and then when she gave birth, the beaver kits were not there anymore. They apparently had ate the beavers. This is infanticide is something that you'll see in other rodents, for example, in prairie dogs and in squirrels, voles, and so forth. But it takes place in beavers as well. So beavers are very effective in controlling their populations. You don't really need trapping to do that. And this is demonstrated by the Quabbin Reservation or Reservoir study from Busher and Lyon's long-term population dynamics of North American beaver. They tracked beavers at this site on the Prescott Peninsula in Massachusetts over nearly 50 years from 1952 to 1996. And you'll see that there was no trapping going on at all at the site. And you see that beaver populations naturally follow a sigmoidal or bell curve kind of pattern. It will increase, and it did so between basically 1965 and 1975, but then it stabilized for a while and then went down and stabilized at the low level that it began with. So beavers will, it doesn't really make sense to say beavers will overpopulate because they naturally control their population like this in a cyclical kind of pattern. At Sage Hang Creek in California, at the opposite end of the country, similar kind of pattern. It goes up and it goes down, and it did that twice between 1945 and 91. And these studies seem to indicate that trapping is counterproductive to this self-regulation. One of the ways it does that is by removing older adults. Trapping stimulates younger female beavers to mature earlier by as much as 8 months and have larger litters. This is from Hodgson Social Dynamics within an unexploited beaver population, or PhD dissertation. Another way they do that is by creating empty habitat niches. So the beavers will say, oh, there are empty habitats to be occupied that will promote more dispersal of the 2-year-olds. Beaver Armageddon. Have you all seen this graph? I've seen this many times when the Fish and Wildlife Department makes presentations on beavers. This was provided for me by Dave Wattles, the Massachusetts fur bearer biologist, in April of 2021. We had an email exchange, and this is the source of the claim that we need trappers to control beaver populations, because Massachusetts enacted a trapping ban in 1996 by ballot initiative. And this graph seems to say, well, look what happens when you ban trapping. After 1996, population increased by 50%. But where does that come from? Because Massachusetts, like Vermont, tracks beaver populations by pelts, by counting the trapped pelts and seeing that pattern over time. But if, the trap pelts went from 1,136 before the ban to just 98 after the ban. So where is the data coming from that shows beaver populations exploded? I asked this question of Dave Wattles, the fur bearer biologist in Massachusetts. His response was, harvest was greatly reduced after 96. A valid question is, how did that affect the population estimate in those following years? Did low harvest numbers inflate the estimate lower, or doesn't that matter? I am not familiar enough with the inner workings of the model to even speculate. So the bottom line is, I have no clue. We have no clue what happened to population because simply the data isn't there. There's no evidence about what happens to population if you're relying on trap pelts. The best way, the most accurate way to track beaver populations is on the ground colony counts. This is what was done at Quabbin Reservation and Sage Hen Creek. They actually had they had graduate students walk streams and ponds looking for evidence of beavers, namely the sticks that were cached by the lodge, or by cut shrubs and trees that were chewed by beavers, or else by They also did road surveys as well. Also evidence that they were repairing dams. So the best way to track beaver populations is on the ground colony counts. But, you know, Fish and Wildlife has the Massachusetts experience on its webpage. And I think this is, you know, really misinformation when it says that, you know, as a result, this is a screenshot from that website, that beaver harvest dropped from 1,000 to 98, and yet beaver population doubled in the year after the ban. Well, where is that coming from? Where is the evidence for that? The evidence simply isn't there. Also, if you look at the bottom of the screenshot, they say that as many beavers are trapped today as prior to the ban. But, you know, the red bars represent emergency permit takes. After 2001, they allowed town health boards to apply for emergency permits to trap the beavers. But a permit is not the same as a pelt. You know, the yellow bars represent actual pelts that were trapped. A permit is simply a permission to trap a beaver. It's not an actual pelt. And we all know, for example, that, you know, many more permits are granted to hunt deer, for example, than are, you know, the number of deer that are actually hunted. So it's really comparing apples and oranges there. So, you know, we talk about the social or cultural carrying capacity, as well as the biological carrying capacity of beavers. And I think it's really disingenuous to say, well, if we don't trap, beaver populations explode. That doesn't really help in terms of increasing the social carrying capacity or the social acceptance of beaver benefits on the landscape. Trapping is a means of a population and nuisance control. You know, the literature doesn't support that either. H. Bryant White, he's done all the research for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is quoted by the Vermont Fur Bearer newsletter. He says broad generalizations about the effectiveness of avocational trapping at reducing human-wildlife conflicts are unwise. He also pointed me to Clark and Fritzl, a review of population dynamics, and this came to the conclusion that the combination of density-dependent effects and reproduction, mortality, and dispersal make it nearly impossible to control populations of pest species by recreational or commercial harvest. Trapping is a means of population monitoring. Well, the problem here is that trapping is dependent on human factors, the number of active trappers, the intensity with which they trap and how they trap. So you're observing beavers through a human lens rather than observing the beavers directly on the ground. Trapping harvest data as expressed by a catch per unit effort, it's called, can be interpreted differently. Even the Vermont Fur Bearer newsletter points out that keep in mind that factors such as season expansions or reductions, reporting accuracy, and sample size can influence results. So trapping to collect biological data, well, you know, we already have 500 beavers trapped in nuisance conflicts, so there's already plenty of samples without recreational trapping. Beavers generally don't have the same diseases as other animals, partly because they're semi-aquatic. They also groom themselves quite frequently. They have lower rates of rabies, rodenticide, avian influenza, etc. I've never found a tick on a beaver, you know, and he was grooming himself every day. The beaver I had in rehab. Additional samples can also be provided by roadkill, scat, snag fur samples, and so on. About is trapping, underwater trapping of beavers even legal? One of the things happened to me on September 14th of 2021. An enforcement officer from the Department of Environmental Conservation showed up in response to a complaint by a beaver trapper in Roxbury, Jerry D'Amico. And also he was helped by Mike Covey, who is head of the Vermont Traditions Coalition. And they said that I had this you know, this enclosure in the stream, you know, is that legal? And they said no. this violates statute 1259A, prohibited discharges into a stream. And I complied with this NOAB and took that enclosure out of the stream. But, this statute says no person shall discharge any waste, substance, or material into waters of the state. So I had a conversation with Sean McVeigh, who's the Chief Environmental Enforcement Officer, on October 11th, and I discussed with him, well, trappers also discharge into streams and state waters by releasing their traps into the water. What about that? And he said, well, trappers have statutory authority because they're licensed by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I said, well, I'm also licensed by Fish and Wildlife. It's part of the statute that a rehabilitator can house, feed, and care for these animals within consultation as recommended by a biologist and a consulting veterinarian. And his response to me, the last words he said to me was, well, I guess this will be decided in court by a judge. So it's really unclear. There's really a gray area over whether trapping in water is even legal, because it is a discharge, and this was raised by trappers themselves. So I'm just going to end by reviewing, why I think recreational trapping should be banned. For one thing, it promotes good wildlife management policy. I think it would be the best thing to happen to Fish and Wildlife Department, because it would allow the beavers to self-regulate their populations rather than responding to the indiscriminate human impact of trapping. It would maximize the fur bearer populations and their benefits on the landscape. It's popular with the Vermont public. The Center for Rural Studies at UVM conducted a survey in 2017 and found that 75% of respondents supported a ban on trapping. Fish and Wildlife did a survey in 2022 and found that 68% of their respondents opposed recreational trapping. It also removes political influences on wildlife management policy decisions. I think one of the reasons why, the Massachusetts example is up on the Fish and Wildlife website is because this really justifies trapping. Because if you're going to have beavers in your living room, if you're afraid that beavers will, populate to such an extent, then, you're going to support trapping to reduce those number of animals. But that's really the politics determining the science rather than the other way around. I think a ban would also promote sustainable long-term solutions to human-wildlife conflict. It would resolve that legal ambiguity surrounding underwater trapping. And it can also be flexible. Other states that have enacted a trapping ban have still allowed for exceptions for nuisance control, research, and relocation. So that's my presentation. I greatly appreciate your invitation to speak before you today, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I'm impressed that you got through 42 slides in the amount of time that you did.
I was a college professor for 20 years, so I'm used to presenting before I'd have a class size about this. So I'm used to it.
Representative Tagliavia, then Weaver.
Questions.
Sure.
Do you believe that nuisance trapping should be banned altogether? What do we do with respect to roads that are endangered being washed out?
Yeah, I think that's a legitimate question. I think other states that have banned trapping, and there's 7 of those listed here, including Massachusetts, still allow for nuisance trapping. I mean, they still keep nuisance trapping as a last resort. If you have to, resolve that situation, you can trap. But in my opinion, trapping is sort of the lazy man solution. It's quick, but it's not really a solution, because what happens the next year? If you trap out the colony, new beavers are simply going to move into that site. If it's a good habitat for beavers, nature abhors a vacuum. They're going to occupy that, and you're going to be on that, what Ben Goldfarb called that treadmill of trapping every year. So, I'll just throw in a shout out to Skip Lyle, a good friend of mine who invented the beaver deceiver. So, this has been around for 30 years. This has been a proven solution that lasts for 20, 30 years. These water flow control devices, and they've been proven to work, and that's the best solution, because then you don't have to revisit the problem every year. But yeah, I mean, you can keep trapping as a last resort, sure.
Well, you define it as recreational trapping, but we have trappers pay for their license, and they're basically financing the control of beavers in this state. Whereas in Massachusetts, they were paying for the nuisance control, so it was actually a cost negative for the state of Massachusetts. Wouldn't you agree?
No, because recreational trapping is not the same as nuisance trapping. When you're trapping for recreational reasons, they're very often trapping in remote areas, wildlife management areas, for example, where there's no conflict whatsoever. So, it's not an issue. I mean, a conflict is sort of a special situation that arises, and then the town asks for help to deal with that problem. That's not the same as having a recreational license and going out somewhere to trap beavers. I mean, that's not really addressing nuisance control. If anything, it will disrupt the colony, cause more dispersal, which can potentially lead to more conflicts. So I would say, town road crews, for example, or V-Trans will often trap if there's a problem with
Oh, I know,
beavers.
I've witnessed it. I
Yeah.
worked for a town that had an issue like that.
Yeah, beavers flooding the roadways, for example. But that's not the same as recreation trapping.
I
we have-
believe we had
One more.
testimony last week that even in this state where we do have recreational trapping, the population has been growing. Population of beavers, I mean.
Well, how is that determined? Is it based on tracking the number of pelts that are being trapped? I mean,
That would be a question for fishing.
yeah, I mean, you have to ask, where is that conclusion coming from? Where is the evidence? As I said, the best way to track beaver populations is on the ground colony counts in a given area, such as the Quabbin Reservoir area. But if trapping as a way of tracking that population, as I said, is a two-edged sword, because you're also killing the beavers at the same time as you're counting them. So it's through the human intervention, through that human lens, and that often depends on the trappers, how intensively they're trapping, how long they're trapping for, and so on. So that's sort of a problematical measure, I would say. I mean, how do we really know that beaver populations are out of control? I mean, I would say that they're never out of control, because beavers themselves will regulate their own populations. If there's not enough habitat to expand into, they're going to control their populations. They're not going to disperse, for example. They're not going to have kids. So, they're going to manage their own populations, and they're pretty ruthless and effective at doing that. And then, it's a cyclical pattern. The population will go down as, the habitat is occupied or is used up. There's no food to support the colonies.
I'm
that-
really aware of the next witness and us getting back on.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
One more question from Representative Labor.
Thank you. John, my own experience is a little bit different than yours. I have a 3-acre beaver pond. I put in a beaver baffle system because I wanted to retain them. I enjoyed the fishing in that pond, one of the biggest reasons. And it's remote. But after 4 years, between the third and the fourth year, they ate themselves out of house and home and booked out.
Right.
It wasn't because of trapping. And it wasn't because of lack of generation of new kits. They just booked out.
Right.
When they booked out, that dam lasted another season. Without maintenance, come a heavy wet March, it ruptured. When it went south, it took out a road.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, has Vermont Fish and Wildlife discussed a reduction, a need in the reduction for the length of the trapping season in case they can't regulate enough? It's my understanding we've only got 279 licensed beaver trappers,
Yeah, that's correct, I believe. Yeah.
many of whom have not trapped in years. And that's only resulted in 1174 pelts. Maybe we shouldn't be measuring just on pelts.
Well, I mentioned that because what it means for the habitat. I mean, you're right that, the beavers will often move on. That's a natural process, a cyclical process. When they run out of food at a site, they will move to another site. And then the beaver dam will degrade, as you say. But if the beavers are trapped, then you wouldn't have any beavers to create new habitat that would replace the habitat that you lost.
When these,
So you're losing the habitat.
when these booked out, they went a half mile south and they plugged up a culvert.
Okay.
July 29th and 30th this last summer, took out that bridge.
Yeah, yeah.
That was
Yeah,
a
I mean-
major expense.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that Skip Lyle could address. I mean, he said to me, there's not a site I can't resolve non-lethally. I mean, he's been doing this for 30 years and, that's something for him that, I'm just a wildlife rehabilitator. I'm not a beaver deceiver expert, but that's something that he could address and he could resolve that problem so it doesn't happen again. But my point is that those beavers would create new habitat that replace the old habitat, so you're not losing net habitat. I mean, one of the missions of the Fish and Wildlife Department is to conserve the plants, animals, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. But if you're trapping beavers, 1,200 beavers a year, you're losing at least 200 acres of habitat every year. So you're losing very valuable habitat, brings benefits to all Vermonters. I mean, we all benefit from, beavers on the landscape, from climate change or flooding catchment areas, and so on and so on. And you've all heard about that, of course, from other witnesses. But, my point is that if we want to maximize the benefits of beavers, why are we trapping? That's the essential question you have to ask yourselves.
Thank you. That was
Yeah.
really
Thank you so
interesting
much.
testimony.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Is question time done?
It is. We need to move on to our
Okay.
next.
Of course it is.
I can answer your question later at another time.
Right. Next, we'll invite up Robert Hyams.
I guess a question before I go too far, that how much time do we have
We have about a half an hour if we can
to go there?
get started. Yep. It'd be great if you were already logged in.
In deference to you guys, I know it's probably been a long day. I can also do the talking points and forego the Zoom.
No, I think we have time for you.
Okay.
Make sure your sound is down.
Before we get started, I could see if maybe we can get Mike Covey from Vermont Traditions so that maybe we can get his perspective as well. Thank you.
Should be able to share your screen now.
Okay.
out of that for just a second. We'll go back to a Zoom link. We're gonna share your desktop, or did you pull it up on a certain application that you'd like to share?
No, it's,
Okay.
well, it's on a desktop. It's on a different desktop. This one.
Press share. And then go to the document that you'd like to share.
Hey, look at
There
that.
you go.
Thank you for your patience. Thank you. My name is Robert Hyams, and I was invited to present to your committee, I think based on the basis of a document I shared with Representative Sheldon. It's about evaluating beaver complexes for phosphorus reduction capacity. Phosphorus reduction is a big issue in Vermont in the Lake Champlain watershed. Act 171. I believe you guys have heard about that this week, and it's was Emily Bird in here?
This morning.
She presented on functioning floodplain analysis. That ring any bells?
We're having functioning floodplains in on Friday.
Oh, okay. I'll give you a little preview. All right. Just gonna. Let's. Okay, so. Beavers, they're having their day in Vermont. You guys are hearing all kinds of stuff about it. There's books about it, conferences about it. House committee hearings on beavers. I've been invited here to present a certain perspective, and I hope it ties into a lot of the stuff that you guys have already heard about. Who am I? For 12 years, I've run a business, Riverscape Ecology, and provide restoration, field services for streamscapes and other plant communities. Streamscape is a stream channel and the associated floodplains. In my line of work, we cross paths with beavers, and that's where I get a lot of my insight from. In addition, I'm an INTP for any Myers-Briggs people out there. And so what they say about INTPs is the world is infinitely interesting to us, which is good. The bad thing is the world is infinitely interesting to us. So if I end up on tangents, that is why. Beavers, you've heard about the benefits, the ecosystem services. They are conferred across, let's look at Vermont. They are conferred across the population. Everyone can experience the benefits of beavers. Now, with those benefits come costs, and yet those costs are borne by the landowners, the individual landowners where the beavers decide to set up shop. And it could be private landowners. It could also be, probably every town in Vermont has beavers and beavers that they need to deal with. So, a lot of science you've heard about, biology, from the previous presenter, and water, chemistry, physics, everything. That's all important. That said, I think if we're going to resolve the big issues, it's going to come from sociologists. They're the ones that are going to have to help us figure out how to deal with some of these issues. So this is my attempt at sociology. So we have the beaver tolerance continuum. And at one end of the spectrum, we have those that are, and we're talking about the landowners. We have those that are all in on beavers, and they do what they can to accommodate beavers, and they love watching the beavers. At the other end of the spectrum, we have the people that just have no interest in beavers and just don't even want to talk about beavers. I'm guessing that's 10 to 15% on either end. So what do we have in the middle? I think we have a bunch of people who beavers, they can appreciate the benefits of beavers, but do they really want them on their land? Maybe not. Okay, so once again, ecosystem services is we're going to talk in terms of ecosystem services, which you've been hearing about all week. And the important part of this is that these are benefits conferred to humans, okay, and the human population by a natural ecosystem. Here's a list. I don't think there's anything overly controversial about this list. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. But with the ecosystem services, then you have to start talking about the costs. And once again, the costs are borne by the individual landowners. Okay, and here's a list of potential costs. I would say right now, when we look at that 80% of landowners who may be open to beavers, when they actually do the math, the costs outweigh the benefits. So how do we change that? How do we make it right by landowners? There's basically two approaches to accomplishing this. One is to reduce the costs, the damage that's done on people's landscapes by beavers. And beavers, okay, I'm going to say Skip Lyle. This is the only time I'm going to mention Skip. I'm sure but Skip is really the authority on this in terms of how to manage beavers across a landscape. It does not have to be an all or nothing proposition to have beavers on your land. Okay, you can limit the extent of their, of the areas of inundation. You can protect individual trees. It just takes some active management. The second point, how do we make it right by landowners? How about we start paying landowners for the ecosystem services provided by beavers? Now that sounds like kind of a crazy thing to do. How do we do this? Ecosystem services typically are, they're discrete, they're measurable, but how do we put a price tag on it? Well, in the Lake Champlain watershed, we have actually done that for one of the ecosystem services, which is phosphorus reduction. We can measure how much phosphorus is being abated by a beaver colony. And you can go to the clean water service provider and say, this is what we got. How much do you want to pay us for this? So it is uniquely a fully monetizable ecosystem service. And I think we should try and take advantage of that. So this is where I think it gets us. If we reduce the impacts onto the land, we manage the beavers there, and we can provide payment for ecosystem services, and I think we tip the balance in favor of beavers. Okay, how do we credit landowners for phosphorus attenuation? Now this, Annika, can I just switch screens here, do you think?
You should be able to. You can,
If I just-
stop the share for a second and then you can reshare.
Question. All right. You know what? We're going to hold off on that. So I presented a paper to Representative Sheldon, and was that shared with?
No.
Basically what it is a,
Send you this.
anyhow, I could share it afterwards.
It's up on the webpage. People.
Okay. Basically what it is, I took a DEC approved system for evaluating phosphorus abatement and applied it to an existing beaver complex in Heinsberg. And I came up with a number for how much phosphorus was removed. Now, I had that analysis reviewed by, some of the key, engineers who were involved in coming up with a functioning floodplain initiative methodology. And so it's a good analysis. And I think if you look at the document, it's also, there's a wonderful link there. Let me get through this. Maybe I could pull up the link afterwards. And it's a great show and tell, and it just really kind of, it gives you a wonderful view of what impact, of how beavers can really transform a streamscape. So, given that, all right, the beavers have done it, right? They're giving us our phosphorus reduction and we didn't have to pay anything for it. All good. Well, thing about those beavers is those beavers chose right, okay? They ended up, this is on town-owned land, on a park managed by the Conservation Commission with little infrastructure potential. So they done good. Now, their fate is fine, and they've been there since 2018, and I think they will get to stay there as long as they want. But that's not the fate for all the beavers, as we know. Here's a neighboring watershed in 2023. Once again, another lovely beaver complex. And there it is last week in 2025. So maybe these beavers chose wrong. I'm not saying that the landowner, necessarily took action to get rid of beavers, but anyhow, here it is 2 years later, and there's really no sign of the beaver complex. And any of the phosphorus abatement is largely gone. Okay. Now, Fish and Wildlife gave a statistic for how many, I think it was 500, I don't know how many nuisance beaver trappings in a year. But I think we have to really question what that number represents, because I would posit that the majority of landowners that have a conflict with beavers don't necessarily go through Fish and Wildlife. Landowners often are very capable. They like to deal with their land, with their issues themselves. They call Fish and Wildlife, that's paperwork, that's time, that's money. And unfortunately, people have excavators and they take excavators to beaver complexes. And I've seen it in Vermont. And if you question whether it's a thing, Google excavator and beaver dam, and you will have pages and pages of videos posted about people taking beaver complexes out. So it really is a thing. Now, I presented this to DEC, this idea of beaver complex delivering this ecosystem service and phosphorus in terms of phosphorus reduction. And I'm not going to say they weren't receptive, but they don't want to do anything with that concept. DEC, their focus is on identifying and funding field practices that yield measurable phosphorus reductions. And that's great. And then if you look at sort of what I do, which is presented below, there's nice overlap. This is fun work. I enjoy doing this kind of work, but I have to say it is not nearly as effective as what beavers can do. So let's look at, here's a little case study. This is a very modest riverscape restoration project. It's modest in scale. It's 450 linear feet of stream channel in Charlotte. And so the first thing we do, we reach out to some of the regulatory authorities. And in this case, I reached out to Army Corps of Engineers because we need a permit from them. And they replied with this, with quite a laundry list of things that need to get figured out. They need data, they need analyses, they need permissions from other entities. That's all stuff that I, as a contractor, I have to figure this stuff out. I need to coordinate with all these different entities, and all these things, they're not, it's all good stuff. It's important, but it is a lot. Now, if you look in the northeast corner of that site, if you look on the right side in the upper right corner, you see those question marks there. And if we zoom in on that, you say, oh, son of a gun, beavers have beat us to it. So here it is, the beavers are doing, they are doing the same practice that we are proposed to do. They're doing it without any regulatory authority to do it, without any paperwork, and no problem. And I guarantee you, they are doing it better than any of us would ever do it. Okay, not only do they do a better installation, they maintain the installation. Okay, now there's two numbers that I'm going to throw at you. 7.1 and 30. Just the other day, I talked to a clean water service provider from the North Lake District. That's Burlington, kind of Burlington area, Chittenden County North. In the 2.5 years that they have been working on phosphorus abatement projects, they have completed 2 projects for a total phosphorus reduction of 7.1 kilograms per year. The beaver complex, that's in that other document, that maybe I'll pull it up after this, is credited with 25 to 30 kilograms phosphorus reduction per year. So in 2.5 years, they yielded 7.1 kilograms. That one beaver complex alone, 25 to 30 kilograms. So we are missing the boat. And if we're not giving landowners the means to protect beaver complexes, we're losing beaver complexes. And with that, we're losing the phosphorus reduction that the EPA, the federal, does the EPA exist anymore? Well, if they still exist, anyhow, the EPA has mandated the state of Vermont to remove phosphorus from Lake Champlain. And if we're not doing it with beavers, we're not getting it done, because what we're trying to do, with field practices just is not going to cut it. So once again, here's our list of modest list of ecosystem services conferred by beaver complexes. And you lump all, so putting all those together, it looks a lot like ecosystem resiliency. And honestly, speaking as a taxpayer, when it comes to global warming and climate change, nothing we do in this state is going to move the needle on climate change. It doesn't matter. We could go all solar, we could go all coal, and we're not budging the needle. The one thing that we can impact is how Vermont lands and waterways will respond to the added stressors due to climate change. And getting more beavers on the landscape is one way of doing that. Probably our quickest, fastest way of making that happen. And I say, as a taxpayer, I'd rather direct our resources towards resiliency than towards trying to cool the planet. Any questions at this point? I'm going to see if I could pull up that other document, because it's kind of cool. Okay, let's see this. So this is kind of fun. I was telling you about the beaver complex in the park. Okay, so this is aerial imagery from 2018. Okay, this is just right off the Vermont website. And what you have here is typical Champlain Valley, probably a ditch straightened stream. It's a very discrete channel. Can't really say much about, floodplain connection from an aerial shot like this. But this is after 3 years of beaver colonization. You could just see, it went from a total homogeneous system to just pure heterogeneity. There's so much variation in here. And this is great imagery. So this we did with a drone. And you could just see that there's habitat for everything in here. And it was really cool. So the stream before the beavers got there, every year it would dry up, every year it would flood. And now we have sort of this constant baseline flow. We have fish. There were never fish in the park. And now we have fish that have extended all the way, upstream of the park because of this beaver complex. And, it's countless species of wildlife are using this. And once again, it's in a wonderful place because, like I say, the beavers chose wisely. There is a road down, at the southern end. But what they did, they've extended their colony both above and below the park. They put a dam above the culvert and below the culvert, so they're not going to block the culvert. So it's kind of a win-win. But like I say, if we are not helping landowners, they are not protecting beaver colonies. And we need beaver colonies to get the ecosystem services, to clean up Lake Champlain and all the other benefits. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Couple minutes for questions. Members have questions. Thank you. Okay, we are adjourned for the afternoon, and we'll see you back here tomorrow morning at 9.